February 2017. Two Airbus A340s depart from Athens, Greece. Their filed destination, Kazakhstan. But once they cross into Iranian airspace, both aircraft vanish from radar. No distress calls, no updated routing data, just silence. What happened next exposed the blueprint for how Russian airlines would try to survive sanctions. Picture this. You're boarding a flight in Moscow, settling into what looks like a standard Airbus cabin. The interior is spotless. The entertainment screens work. Everything feels routine. But what you don't see is far more alarming. The critical navigation module beside the captain, smuggled into Russia inside a traveler's suitcase, the engine powering the aircraft, cannibalized off another jet abandoned in a remote hangar, dismantled like a donor organ. As for the braking system, one set hasn't functioned correctly for months, but the airline continues flying anyway. This isn't some dystopian thriller. It's the lived reality for millions of passengers flying on Russian carriers right now. This is the story of the dangerous and deteriorating state of Russian aviation. When Russia escalated its invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, the response from Western governments was immediate and unprecedented. Within days, a wave of sanctions began reshaping global aviation in ways not seen since the Cold War. But these weren't just financial penalties. They were an existential threat to Russia's commercial aviation industry. The sanctions hit from every direction at once. First came airspace bans. European countries and North America closed their skies to Russian carriers. Russia retaliated by shutting its own airspace to Western airlines. For carriers like Aeroflot, S7, and Ural Airlines, this meant losing their most profitable international routes, London, Paris, New York, Tokyo, practically overnight. But the airspace restrictions were just the opening act. The real crisis came from the collapse of the supply chain. Boeing and Airbus immediately halted all parts deliveries, technical assistance, and maintenance support. Within weeks, Russia's aviation sector found itself isolated from the global ecosystem that had sustained it for decades. The scale of the problem was staggering. Russia's commercial fleet consisted of roughly 800 passenger jets. Around 67% of them were Western-built, mainly Boeing and Airbus aircraft. And even worse, nearly two-thirds of these planes weren't owned by Russian airlines. They were leased from companies based in Ireland, the United States, and elsewhere. So when sanctions landed, Russian carriers weren't just cut off from parts and service. They were flying aircraft they didn't legally own and could no longer lawfully keep. Russian authorities faced a stark choice: surrender the fleet or find an alternative. In March 2022, the Russian government made a decision that would echo in courtrooms for years. It issued an emergency decree instructing Russian carriers to retain all leased aircraft already inside Russia and re-register them domestically. In simple terms, Russia told its airlines to keep the planes, effectively seizing them. Over 500 Western-built jets, valued at more than $10 billion, were suddenly trapped. For the leasing companies, this became the largest aircraft seizure in aviation history. What followed was one of the most complex legal battles the industry has ever seen. In June of last year, Ireland, home to many of the affected lessors, had to set up a temporary additional courtroom to handle the largest legal case in the nation's history. Not because of the money involved, though that was enormous, but because over 180 lawyers were required to argue it. The case centered on roughly 2.5 billion euros related to only about 80 of the more than 500 seized jets. But things became even more complicated. Insurers who were supposed to reimburse the leasing companies claimed that there had been no physical loss of the aircraft. Their argument was that the planes still existed and could theoretically be recovered someday. Some insurers even argued the losses were self-inflicted since many lease contracts were terminated due to sanctions. Similar disputes are now underway in courts in the United Kingdom and the United States. Some exhausted lessors have accepted settlements from Russian insurers, effectively selling the aircraft to Russian carriers at massive discounts. Yet more than half of the seized jets remain trapped in legal uncertainty, technically stolen, practically unrecoverable. Russian officials hailed this as a win. They insisted their airline industry was running as normal, just as it had before the war, claiming they had outmaneuvered the West. But beneath the surface, the situation is far more alarming. Seizing the planes was only step one. The real crisis was keeping them operational without access to the global supply chain required to maintain modern aircraft. And honestly, the strategies Russian airlines adopted are as desperate as they are dangerous. Before the invasion, Russian carriers relied on major maintenance facilities in Germany and Hong Kong to service their Western aircraft. These centers had direct access to certified Boeing and Airbus parts, official technical documentation, and approved repair procedures. When a part needed replacement, it arrived quickly with full traceability. That system collapsed in an instant. Even China, despite not imposing direct sanctions on Russia, told its MRO centers to stop servicing Russian aircraft. Why? Beijing feared secondary sanctions that could cost China access to Boeing and Airbus parts, which would devastate its own aviation sector. Losing Russian business was nothing compared to losing global aviation access. Russian airlines were left in a dire position. Modern aircraft require constant maintenance, with thousands of components needing periodic replacement. Without official parts, there was only one path left: cannibalization, stripping some aircraft for parts to keep others flying. Before the war, Aeroflot operated brand new A350s on prestige routes like New York and Tokyo. Today, its active fleet has shrunk to fewer than 180 aircraft. Around 15% of its jets sit parked or are being stripped for parts. Inside hangars around Moscow, a grim routine has emerged. Mechanics refer to it as organ donation. State-of-the-art jets are being gutted to keep older ones in the air. A350s sit with panels open, their wiring marked for salvage. Everything usable, hydraulic systems, avionics, sensors, seats, even galley equipment, is removed for installation elsewhere. The desperation has produced scenarios unimaginable for any Western carrier. Investigations confirm that Aeroflot operated several jets with one of their brake systems inoperative for extended periods. That means commercial planes, carrying hundreds of passengers, flew with compromised braking capabilities simply because parts were unavailable. As a result, airlines have returned to older Soviet-era designs, Tupolev Tu-104s, Antonov turboprops, and even the Ilyushin Il-96, a four-engine aircraft that burns 40% more fuel than modern twin-engine models. But the cannibalization wasn't the end. Russian airlines began building a vast shadow supply chain. And this is where the safety concerns become truly disturbing. Enter companies like Turboshaft FZE, a UAE-based firm with a strange history. It had originally sold used Soviet aircraft parts worldwide. But when sanctions isolated Russia, firms like Turboshaft flipped their operation. Instead of exporting Russian parts, they smuggled Western parts into Russia. The methods are, honestly, startling. Customs documents from Moscow's Vnukovo airport revealed that in July 2022, S7 Airlines received shipments of air data inertial reference units, critical navigation devices, stuffed inside passenger luggage. 11 units in total, each weighing around 11 kilograms. These systems feed vital information to an aircraft's autopilot and navigation systems. And, this wasn't an isolated case. A network of small companies, mostly in the UAE, but also operating from China, Turkey, and the Maldives, has sprung up to service this black market. They repackage aircraft components, reroute them through roundabout channels, and provide forged paperwork covering their origin. Here's the frightening part. When you rely on these channels, you have no guarantee of what you're installing. Some parts might be genuine. Some might be counterfeit. Many are used components past their certified service life. In regulated aviation, every critical part has serial numbers, maintenance history, and strict hour and calendar limits. Once a component reaches its limit, it must be removed, overhauled, or scrapped. But when parts arrive stuffed into suitcases with dubious documents, there's just no way to confirm their condition or history. Worse, Turboshaft itself had complaints from customers years ago about the poor quality of its used Soviet parts. Now, Russian airlines are gambling with passenger lives using similar vendors to maintain Western-built jets. And these parts aren't cheap, not at all. Russian airlines are paying enormous sums on the black market, though the real cost may ultimately be measured in safety, not money. The markup on black market aircraft parts is staggering. Russian airlines are reportedly paying close to $100,000 for each of those suitcase smuggled navigation units, almost double the usual cost of $50,000 to $70,000. To help offset these expenses, the Russian government has allocated roughly $2.7 billion to support its airlines as they deal with sanction-related shortages. Even so, carriers in Russia are operating with only a small fraction of the spare parts they actually require. The severity of this crisis became crystal clear during an almost unbelievable incident in September 2023. A Ural Airlines Airbus A320 was forced to make an emergency landing in a muddy field in Siberia after encountering technical issues. More than 150 people were on board when it touched down in a remote area near the Kazakh border. Under normal conditions, an aircraft stranded in such a location would be dismantled and transported by road to a proper facility. But Ural Airlines seriously contemplated trying to fly the plane out of that field. They waited through the entire winter, hoping the ground would freeze solid enough to act as a makeshift runway. Engineers even evaluated whether a temporary strip could be built. The plan was only abandoned because the soil never froze hard enough to support the aircraft's weight, not because the idea was recognized as incredibly risky. That such an operation was considered at all highlights the desperation in Russia's aviation sector. In today's environment, no aircraft is expendable. Facing a shortage of planes and parts, Russian aviation officials began studying how other countries under similar sanctions have managed to stay airborne. They quickly found a model in Iran. For decades, Iran has operated under sweeping international sanctions, yet managed to keep its airlines functioning, albeit with significantly compromised safety standards. In April 2023, Aeroflot sent one of its Airbus A330s to Tehran for maintenance at Mahan Air's facility. This was effectively a trial to see whether Iran could service Russia's modern aircraft. But, the work was so poor that even Aeroflot was dissatisfied. Still, Iran offered something Russia needed: a roadmap for surviving long-term sanctions. Iran had spent years building a vast web of front companies and intermediaries to quietly obtain aircraft that were otherwise impossible to buy. They often did so by exploiting loopholes, mislabeling shipments, and rerouting aircraft mid-flight. One of the most striking examples dates back to 2016. Turboshaft, the UAE-based company mentioned earlier, bought two aging Airbus A340s from the Greek government. These jets had once flown for Olympic Airways, but had sat idle at Athens airport since 2009. Greece sold them as scrap, but Turboshaft had other plans. Somehow, they restored the aircraft enough to make them flyable and prepared to sell them to Kazakhstan's Bek Air. So in February 2017, both jets departed Athens with filed flight plans to Kazakhstan. But well, they never arrived. As they crossed into Iranian airspace, both A340s vanished from radar. No distress calls, no tracking data, nothing. Days later, it emerged that both aircraft had diverted to Tehran and were absorbed into Mahan Air's fleet. One of them is reportedly still flying today. This wasn't an isolated case. Iran later obtained 4 more Airbus A340s through nearly identical tactics. Former Turkish Airlines jets that were supposedly en route from South Africa to Uzbekistan ended up in Tehran. And in February 2024, 2 additional A340s arrived from Lithuania under suspiciously similar circumstances. Each time, the pattern repeated. Aircraft purchased for one destination, then quietly diverted to Iran mid-flight. Now, Russia appears to be using the same playbook. Recently, a brand new Airbus A320neo, originally bought as a private jet before the 2022 sanctions, somehow wound up inside Russia after cycling through multiple registrations in different countries. It essentially jumped across jurisdictions until it finally landed on Russian soil. According to Russia's own Versa media, more than 28 foreign-made aircraft were smuggled into Russia in 2024 alone, ranging from small business jets to full-sized airliners. Despite these workarounds, Russia insists it will revive its domestic aircraft building industry. The goal is to reduce reliance on Western jets by boosting production of homegrown models like the MC-21, the Sukhoi Superjet, and the Tupolev Tu-214. On paper, these aircraft would eventually replace the cannibalized Boeings and Airbuses. In reality, the same sanctions choking maintenance and spare parts access are also crippling production. The MC-21, intended to compete with the Boeing 737 and Airbus A320, was hit hard when sanctions cut off its supply of Pratt & Whitney engines. Russia switched to the domestically built Aviation PD-14, but this engine has proved far less reliable, requiring more maintenance and suffering frequent technical issues. The situation worsened when Russia's Kommersant newspaper reported that Aviation was scaling back production to only 7 engines per year due to manufacturing problems. Think about that, 7 engines annually. Aeroflot alone has ordered 100 MC-21s. At that rate, fulfilling just that single order would take decades, and that's assuming every engine works flawlessly and none ever need replacing. The Sukhoi Superjet faces similar hurdles. Its engines were produced in partnership with France's Safran, and sanctions severed that supply chain. Reports suggest Russian airlines are now reusing filters that should be replaced once clogged. Technicians are cleaning and reinstalling them instead. If these are fuel filters, the implications for engine safety are extremely troubling. What we're witnessing isn't a smooth adaptation to new circumstances. It's the gradual erosion of an entire industry's safety culture. Modern aviation's extraordinary safety record was built on strict procedures, standardized maintenance, and certified components. Russia is now operating in open defiance of those principles. The aircraft passengers board in Russia may look perfectly fine from the outside, but beneath the polished exterior lies a system patched together with smuggled components, scavenged parts, and increasingly risky stopgap measures. Authorities continue to insist everything is normal, yet all available evidence points to an industry surviving on borrowed time. Every flight relying on the hope that its improvised fixes will keep holding. The real question isn't whether Russian aviation will return to its pre-war standards. That possibility has already evaporated. The pressing question is how long this fragile system can continue before the consequences become unavoidable. And when that moment arrives, the cost won't be measured in aircraft or insurance disputes, but in human lives.